Hey everyone, Richard from Digital Foundry here, and what you're seeing here is Overwatch running at max settings at 4K resolution, and we're using GTX 1080 here, the MSI Gaming Z variant, and yeah, essentially 4K 60 FPS, and that's a lock. And we're just going to take a look here at the settings just to confirm that. You can see the resolution there, epic settings. We'll dip into the advanced area in a moment just to confirm the resolution scale is indeed at 100%, and there it is. And yeah, it's a fantastic experience. The artwork just looks absolutely brilliant at 4K, and it's just a beautiful looking game. And the fact that with GTX 1080 we can enjoy this at 60 FPS locked, it's just a joy, to be honest. Absolutely wonderful experience. And this is kind of the point of the video really. Previous GPUs, R9 Fury X, Titan X, they didn't really have the GPU power to run at a locked 4K 60Hz, and yeah, they were kind of marketed as 4K GPUs, and they just weren't really up to snuff unless you lowered resolution, which you don't really want to do if you've got a 4K screen, or you dropped settings, and even then in a lot of cases frame rates just weren't really good enough. So yeah, let's just go and take a look here at the actual system settings that we've got here, just to confirm that everything is on the level. So yeah, this is the desktop here, and there's CPU Z open, and there we can see that we've got 4.6 gigahertz on the i7-6700K, and yeah, looking over to the GPU Z, you can see that we've got the MSI Gaming Z there, which has a much higher boost clock than the standard. And yeah, on the left there, DRAM 1500 megahertz, so that would be 3000 megahertz DDR4 there, which is all good. And here we're opening MSI Afterburner because we're going to be attaching the overclock, which is the furthest I could really take the Gaming Z. So it's plus 80 to the core, plus 440 to the RAM. And I'll be perfectly honest with you, you can just keep the memory overclock, which I would recommend, but the core on this one is already extremely high, and plus 80 megahertz isn't going to make a huge difference. And just to confirm there, DSR, we're not using it. I've turned those factors off there. This is a pure 4K capture from one PC going into another one which has a 4K capture card. And let's just kick off in Crysis III here. So you can see there, 3840 by 2160, very high settings. VSync on there because I want a 4K experience that is locked to the refresh of the monitor, so a perfect match on resolution and refresh. And as we open Crysis III, you can see we've got a problem, 45-46 FPS, and well, this is an interesting question really. Do you really need ultra settings and equivalent? I mean, what do you actually lose by going down to high? I do think that there is a compromise too far, and you can actually see the difference in Crysis 3 on the medium setting, but high, aside from sort of a lack of tessellation in some areas and slight paring back on shadow distance, it really looks pretty much identical to the full thing, and you get a full 60 Hz here. But as you can see here, alpha effects have a devastating effect on the frame rate there, and that's a theme that we're going to be seeing throughout this demonstration. But generally speaking, Crysis 3 4K 60 FPS on high, and that's brilliant. And in actual fact, that's better than what I achieved when I tried Fury X Crossfire. I got a very similar experience, but I actually had to drop the shadows down to medium there to get anything like 60 FPS we're getting here. And generally speaking, I still think high-end card SLI Crossfire, not really a good idea. One top-end card, go from there. But yeah, Crysis 3, you're going to see that we are still dipping beneath 60 FPS here, and it's really when we see advanced effects work in action, and pretty much less impactful version of that alpha explosion smoke effect that we saw earlier. And but general gameplay, you know, not bad at all. And here's an interesting thing. Although we can't lock at 60 Hz, I reckon that if you can afford a GTX 1080, you should also be considering a G-Sync monitor, and this will pretty much iron out most of the issues that you see here in terms of dropped frames. And if you consider the frame times here between 50 FPS and 60 FPS, 60 is 16.7 milliseconds and 50 is 20, and in the actual course of gameplay you don't really notice a difference. And another game where we can kind of hit that 50 FPS limit comfortably is The Witcher 3, and here you can see in the settings screen 4K. I've gone to high settings here and I have turned off Hairworks, so you can see there everything on high. And again, I don't really think there's a massive difference between high and ultra. One thing I should have done here though is to put the textures to ultra, because you probably get something from that at 4K. But as we move into gameplay here, it's all looking pretty good, isn't it? 60 Hz, not bad at all. Now you can see in the top right we're running MSI Afterburner's on-screen display, and yeah, 60 FPS locked pretty much, but it doesn't stay like that, and you'll see that as we move into the gameplay. But you know, while we're here, let's just appreciate the visuals, the quality of the visuals that CD Projekt Red have got here, and the fact that with very minimal compromise we are running this full 4K 60 FPS, and again, we wouldn't really be able to do this on any other GPU. So yeah, good stuff. But now you can see here as the Griffin appears, and there'll be another intensive alpha effect kicking in very shortly, and you can see there frame rates dip again. That 60 lock, we're not going to be keeping it, but it's still generally a pretty solid experience. And yeah, let's kick in with the gameplay here. As we take on the Griffin, we're going to be using magical effects and stuff like that, and you'll see that again, not a locked 60 here, we're still dropping frames. But another thing that would be good would be a 50 Hz mode on a 4K screen rather than the 60. I mean, that basically drops your GPU requirement there and then, and you don't really notice a huge amount of difference. And one thing which I would say, if you've got a G-Sync screen or you're thinking of buying one, definitely try adding a frame rate limiter. Now, G-Sync will smooth out the experience, but it doesn't completely eliminate judder because the frame persistence is still different. If you can standardize that to a locked 45 or 50, you might actually be pleasantly surprised by the quality of the experience there. Okay, so Star Wars Battlefront 4K, dipping into the settings here, ultra all round except for 3 areas. Shadow quality is on high, effects quality and ambient occlusion, and we're using the speeder bike chase here as a kind of stress test. On the console versions of the game, DICE actually dialed down the settings here compared to the rest of the levels, and that's because it's so hard on GPU. And you can see here that by and large, yeah, we're pretty much doing pretty well here. Not a locked 60 FPS completely, but pretty close to it. Now you will note when we're getting some advanced effects work here, blaster fire and whatnot, you will see a drop, and I think maybe the reflections here might be causing a few issues here, but it's still very close to 60. And with minor tweaking you might be able to get that lock, but to be honest I didn't really find it that intrusive at all. And yeah, what I'm doing here is popping back into the settings. Now one thing to bear in mind when you want to claim back some frames, shadow quality, it's massively GPU intensive and it's an easy win in terms of clawing back some frame rate, and it does help here a little, but probably not as much as I was expecting. So not a lock, but something pretty close to it. Spectacular looking game though, and I highly recommend playing it at 4K if you can. And if you've got a Fury X or 980 Ti, use that resolution scaler, bring it down to like 85%, 80%. You've got to work really hard to notice the difference, but it still looks spectacular. Okay, next up we're playing Doom on Vulkan, and this was the patch that was released this week. Our ultra settings here, I think I've raised AF up to 16x and I've invoked the nightmare textures because I can on an 8GB card, which is what we've got with the GTX 1080. Now one thing here, I wanted 4K 60, I used VSync. You'll note that we're going above 60 FPS because at the moment the Vulkan patch seems to be locked on borderless full screen mode, so you don't get tearing and the game is generating more frames than you actually see, which isn't ideal, especially when it comes to benchmarking. But you can get a pretty good idea of how this game is performing here. I'd say if we could lock to 60 we'd be in with a pretty good shout here, but this new level shows that on those ultra settings we may have to compromise because we are dipping beneath here quite significantly when there's a lot of effects work going on. This particular area really can cause some problems. You'll note that I used it in the 1070 versus Fury X benchmark that we released recently. So yeah, check that out. Pretty good stuff, but you know, when we're dipping beneath 50 FPS, I do wonder whether we should be on ultra. So high settings would be worth checking out there. Okay, so next up, Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, 4K 60Hz is the target. All looking pretty good so far. Let's dip into the settings, graphic settings, there we go. Okay, 4K resolution confirmed, pretty much everything on high or extra high, which is as high as it will go, but I have dropped shadows and ambient occlusion from extra high to high. Doesn't really have a huge impact on the experience, but it certainly is the difference between a consistent, or at least a fairly consistent consistent 4K 60 and not having it. So yeah, we're into some gameplay here where I am particularly inept at this game, clearly, but again, some frame rate drops on translucent effects, that sort of thing. Alpha really is quite heavy on the GTX 1080 at 4K, and yeah, I mean, we do have to wonder whether HBM could have made a difference here, whether it's a GPU core issue or whether it's a memory bandwidth issue. And I have to admit, I'm really looking forward to seeing the next gen Titan, the next gen 1080 Ti, if you like, which will be using a new die and HBM2 memory. I think that will be pretty much the definitive 4K card at that point, but that's something which we'll have to check out in the future. In the meantime, we're moving on to GTA 5, and well, first impressions, pretty impressive, huh? Not too bad at all. This is 4K, this is 60 Hz, and yeah, let's take a look at those settings. Basically everything is ramped up to the max except for MSAA, which I've turned off. Pixel density at 4K is so high, I really don't think you need anything other than a post-process solution. I've also dropped grass down from ultra to medium, and it's surprising just how much of an impact this has on performance. It's just mind-blowing in a way. And the medium setting is lower than the Xbox One and PS4 equivalents, which isn't fantastic, but it is the difference between running this at 60 Hz or not running it at 60 Hz. So unfortunately it's something we had to do there. Obviously with a bit more time we could have done a bit more work on that. Now by and large we are at 4K 60 here, and it is lovely, but there are some scenarios where we get some pretty odd glitching here, and if you look at this particular area you'll see that we're getting some pretty horrible stutter there, you know, 60 FPS momentarily dropping down to 30. So yeah, that would be your double buffer VSync scenario where we're consistently running over budget on a 16.7 millisecond render time. So with VSync engaged we're dipping down to the next rung down, if you like, which is 33 milliseconds, and it's not good at all. It's the inconsistency mostly that really kills it. Not quite sure what's going on here, but again I do note that it is in foliage heavy scenes, which seems to be the real Achilles heel for GTA 5 here. Anyway, well, that's pretty much the end of this demo. I hope you really enjoyed it. I really wanted to show not just benchmarks for a change. I mean, benchmarks are good as far as they go, and what they're good for is showing the relative performance between one GPU and the next, and that's brilliant. But at the same time, average frame rate shouldn't be considered equivalent to the actual experience. What I wanted to show here is what the current GPU King can actually do in terms of the gameplay experience that the previous one couldn't. And yeah, I think this is pretty much the first fully viable 4K card that doesn't require you to overly compromise your settings or settle for anything less than 50 to 60 FPS. And again, I really would recommend pairing this with an adaptive sync monitor. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this. Do like and subscribe for more Digital Foundry, and I'll see you soon.
Classic DJ.